At 90, I live alone in a house that used to be full of noise. My children don't call anymore. And in that silence, the very silence I spent my whole life afraid of, I found God. If you know that kind of silence, comment one word: faith. I want to see how many of us are out here. And if you have a mother or a father sitting alone tonight, send this to them before it's too late, because this is exactly about them. Here's what those empty rooms finally taught me. The house was never quiet. For 35 years, from the morning Harold and I moved in with 2 children and a third on the way, until the last of the children left for college and their own lives and their own houses in cities I had never imagined them living in. For all those years, the house made noise. It made noise the way houses make noise when they are genuinely inhabited. Footsteps on the stairs at irregular hours, voices overlapping in rooms, the particular percussion of a kitchen being used by people who are hungry and in a hurry, the sound of a screen door closing behind someone who has somewhere to be. I did not appreciate this noise while I was inside it. You rarely do. Harold died in March of 2013. He was 88 years old. And we had been married for 62 years, and the dying was not a surprise. He had been ill for long enough that we had time to say what needed saying, and I am grateful for that. And I do not want to make this into a story about grief, when it is really a story about something that came after grief. But Hal's death is where the quiet began, so I have to place it here. March 2013, a Tuesday morning, and the house, which had never been fully quiet, became all at once very much quieter. The children came for the funeral, all 3 of them. Robert from Chicago, Susan from Atlanta, Diane from Seattle. They stayed for a week, and the house had people in it again. And there was food and conversation, and the gentle chaos of grandchildren who did not fully understand why everyone was sad. And then they went back to their lives, which was right and as it should be, and I was alone. For the first 2 years, they called regularly, weekly some weeks, Robert especially, who had always been the most attentive, who had his father's quality of checking in without being asked. I do not want to tell this story as if my children are villains, because they are not. They are busy people in the middle of their own lives, careers and children and mortgages, and the relentless forward pressure of being in the middle of things rather than at the end of things. They love me. I do not doubt that. What happened was not that they stopped loving me. It was that I stopped being in the daily accounting of their attention, a thing that required attending to. I was fine. I had always been fine. They had learned, from watching me be fine across many years, that fine was my natural state, and they allocated their concern accordingly. By 2017, Robert called every 2 or 3 weeks. Susan perhaps monthly. Her life was the most complicated. 3 children in 3 different schools, a job that required her full attention. Diane called on birthdays and at Christmas, and sometimes in between if something reminded her. And the something that reminded her was usually some item on social media that she wanted to share rather than a specific thought about me. I am not criticizing Diane. I am describing how it works, how a parent becomes, across the quiet attrition of ordinary busyness, someone who is loved but not quite present in the daily imagination of the people who love them. By 2019, Robert had moved to a new position that consumed him entirely for the first year. Susan's husband had a health scare that reorganized everything around him for months. Diane had a baby, my 4th grandchild, and the arrival of a new baby is the event most likely to make everything else recede, including aging mothers on the other coast. The calls became less frequent. I understand why. I am not telling you they were wrong. I am telling you what the house felt like. Christmas of 2019. I had made Christmas in that house for 50 years. Harold and I had hosted it together until the year he died, and then I had hosted it alone for the following years. The children rotated. Some years one came, some years two. Once, memorably, all three at the same time with spouses and grandchildren and chaos I would give anything to have back. Christmas of 2019, I was alone. Not because of conflict, not because of estrangement, because Robert's family had her family's Christmas in Wisconsin that year, and it simply made more sense for them. And Susan's husband was still recovering, and travel felt difficult. And Diane had a 7-month-old, and cross-country travel with a 7-month-old is an ordeal nobody should have to do. All of these reasons were real. None of them was a lie. I made no fuss. I said, of course, I understand. We'll talk on Christmas Day. I did not make a turkey. There seemed no point in making a turkey for one person. I made soup, and I sat at the kitchen table, and they each called. Robert in the morning, Susan in the afternoon, Diane in the evening. And each call was warm and genuine and brief, because they were in the middle of their own Christmases. And I said I was fine, which I was, in the technical sense of continuing to function. And after Diane's call, I sat at the kitchen table in a house that had made Christmas noise for 50 years and listened to it make no noise at all. That was the night I began to understand what I was actually afraid of. Eleanor lives next door. She is 87, 3 years younger than me, and her situation mirrors mine in most of the external ways. Widowed, adult children scattered and largely absent, a house that was once full and is now quiet. Eleanor and I have been neighbors for 30 years. I know her well. What I have watched happen to Eleanor across the years since her husband died is a closing down. A slow but consistent withdrawal from the silence rather than into it. The television on every waking hour. The curtains often closed even on good days. A kind of low-grade bitterness that has seeped into the way she talks about her children, her grandchildren, the world. Eleanor is not a bad person. Eleanor is a person who found the silence intolerable and has been fighting it every day since. And the fighting has cost her something. She is losing. The silence arrived fully in January of 2020. I say it arrived because that is how it felt. Not like an absence, not like a lack, but like a presence that had been waiting at the edge of things and finally stepped in through the door I had stopped being able to close. Harold was gone 7 years by then. The last regular call had faded. The house was quiet in the morning and quiet in the afternoon and quiet in the evening, and there was no longer a structure of noise to wait for, no incoming call that would break it at a predictable hour. The quiet was simply there, all day, every day, like weather that has settled in for a season. I fought it the way Eleanor fought it. Television on by 7 in the morning, not because I was watching it, but because voices in the room, even voices talking about things I had no interest in, felt better than the alternative. I filled the hours with the radio and with tasks I invented, and with phone calls to people I did not have much to say to, because the act of calling was itself a way of breaking the silence, rather than a way of connecting with someone. I was afraid of the silence the way I had been afraid of the dark as a child, irrationally, completely, with a fear that had no specific object, but was the more overwhelming for having none. Then a morning came in February of 2020 when the television broke. I am aware of how this sounds, but I want to tell you exactly what happened, because I think the specifics matter, and I think the ordinary smallness of the event is part of what it means. The television in the living room, The television I had turned on every morning for months, before I had even made coffee, just to have something in the room with me, stopped working. Not dramatically, it simply did not turn on one morning. I pressed the button, nothing. I tried the remote, nothing. I checked the plug and the connection and all the things you check, and the television remained off. And it was 7:30 in the morning, and the house was completely quiet. And I stood in the living room for a moment, not knowing what to do. And then I went and made the coffee. And I sat down at the kitchen table with the coffee going warm between my hands. And the window in front of me showed the yard in the gray February light, the bare oak that Harold had planted 30 years ago. The bird feeder I still fill out of habit, though I rarely sit to watch the birds. And the house was completely silent. And for the first time in months, I did not immediately reach for something to break the silence with. I just sat. I don't know how long I sat. Long enough for the coffee to go from warm to cool. And something happened in that sitting that I am going to try to describe as accurately as I can, because it is the thing I most want you to understand. And I am aware that it is also the thing most likely to sound like something it is not. The silence changed quality. That is the best way I have of saying it. It was the same silence, the same empty house, the same gray yard, the same coffee cup, but the silence stopped feeling like an absence of something I needed and began to feel like the presence of something I had not known was there. It is the difference between a room that is empty because no one has come yet and a room that is quiet because something is already in it and does not need to make noise to be present. The distinction is one I cannot prove to you. I can only tell you that I felt it, and that it was not grief, and that it was not loneliness, and that I had not felt it before. I had gone to church throughout my adult life, the same church Harold and I had attended since we moved to this town in 1965. A modest congregation, nothing dramatic about it. The kind of faith practice that is part of the fabric of a certain kind of American life, and that one does without thinking too deeply about what it means. I have believed in the way you believe in things you have never been made to examine, which is to say, at the surface, comfortably, without urgency. What happened at the kitchen table in February of 2020 was not comfortable, and it was not surface. It was, in the specific way of experiences that rearrange what you thought you knew, urgent. I am not going to tell you I heard a voice, or saw a light, or experienced anything a skeptic could not explain. As an old woman alone in a kitchen, having a moment of unusual stillness after months of loss and isolation. I am going to tell you that in that silence I felt accompanied, genuinely, specifically accompanied, by something I had only nominally believed in for 89 years. Something I had said words about and sung hymns about and could have given you a Sunday school answer about, but that I had never, until that February morning, actually met. That is the only word I have for it. Met. I got up and refilled the coffee, and I did not turn on the television when they repaired it the following week. I sat with the silence instead, the way you sit with someone you have newly discovered and want to spend more time with. Eleanor came for tea in April. We talked about her daughter in Phoenix, who had visited briefly and left again, and I watched Eleanor's face when she talked about her children. The specific, tight expression of someone who has decided their disappointment is a permanent condition, who has organized a life around the fact of being let down. And I thought, that is where I was 3 months ago. I recognized the place. I had stood in that same kitchen with that same face, and I understood what it felt like to be Eleanor right now. And I understood also that Eleanor had not sat in the silence and waited. She had put the television on and stayed. And the television was still on. It would always be on. The company it offered was just good enough to prevent you from finding the other kind. I did not know how to tell Eleanor what had happened to me. I did not try. There is a kind of thing that cannot be transferred in conversation. It can only be experienced, and I had not yet found the language for it that would have made any difference to Eleanor anyway. She left at 4:30. I washed the cups and sat back down at the kitchen table, and the house was quiet, and I was, for the first time I could name it, content. What I kept coming back to in the weeks after that February morning was how long I had been standing at the edge of this. How many mornings across how many years the silence had been available. Before Harold died even, in the small hours when the house was asleep and I was the only one awake, and I had always turned on the kitchen light and put the kettle on and reached for the radio. Not because I needed the radio, because the silence felt like a question I was not prepared to answer. What I learned in February was that the question had always been there, and I had been talking over it for 60 years. The talking was what I had called living, and it was living, genuinely. The noise of a full house is a real and precious thing, and I do not want to suggest otherwise. But under all of it, patient and available, was this. I simply had not stopped long enough to hear it. Here is what the empty rooms taught me. Not in a list, because it is not a list. It is one thing learned in different rooms at different hours, in different qualities of light. The silence is not the punishment. I had spent my whole life treating silence as the thing you have when the good things are gone, the marker of loss, the texture of absence, the sound of being forgotten. And in that kitchen in February, I learned that silence is not the marker of what is missing. It is the condition in which you can finally hear what has always been there, but could not compete with the noise. God does not shout, or if he does, I cannot hear him over the television. Diane's bedroom is at the end of the upstairs hall. She was the last to leave home. She went to college in 2001. And when she left, I closed the door to her room the way you close a chapter you have finished. For 19 years, I kept that door closed. The room behind it had stopped being Diane's room and had become a place I did not need to go into. A room that existed in the category of things I was finished with rather than things I was still in relationship with. After February of 2020, I opened the door. I don't mean this as a symbol, though it may be one. I mean it literally. I opened the door and I went in, and I sat on the edge of the bed in a room that still had some of Diane's things in it. A shelf of books she had not taken, a mirror with its particular light, the way the afternoon comes through that window differently than through any other window in the house. And I sat there, and the room did not feel like loss. It felt like a place where someone I loved had once been fully alive, which is a different thing. The closed door had been protecting me from the feeling. The open door let me be in the feeling and discover that I could be in it without it destroying me. That is what the empty house taught me. Not that my children are gone. They are not gone. They are in Chicago and Atlanta and Seattle, living their lives, which I gave them for exactly this purpose. Not that I am alone. I am not alone. Not in the way I was afraid of being alone. What the empty house taught me is that there is a version of presence available to me that does not depend on footsteps on the stairs or voices in the next room, or a phone that rings at a predictable hour. that I had spent 90 years treating that kind of presence as supplementary, as something that might be real, but was certainly less real than Harold at the kitchen table, or the children asleep upstairs. And the empty house stripped all of that away and left me with only what was underneath. And what was underneath was enough, more than enough. I want to say something to whoever is watching this who is also in a quiet house tonight. Your children love you, even the ones who have gone quiet, even the ones who call less than they should, who are absorbed in their own lives in ways that have made you smaller in their daily field of vision. They love you. They are not thinking about you tonight, which is not the same as not loving you. They are not thinking about you tonight because they are in the middle of their own noise, their own full houses, their own pressing forward movement, and they cannot see yet what you can see, that the noise is not forever, and that what is underneath it is the only thing worth knowing. And if you are the grown child watching this, if you recognize your mother or your father in what I described, the aging parent you have not called in longer than you want to admit, the one who says they are fine and whom you believe because it is easier to believe than to look more carefully. I want to ask you something, not with accusation, with the directness of someone who has 90 years of perspective on what matters and what does not. Call them. Not this weekend, tonight. Because the silence they are sitting in right now is either the silence that is destroying them the way it was destroying Eleanor, or the silence in which they have begun to find something they never expected. Either way, they should not be finding it entirely alone. Either way, your voice in that house tonight would be the right sound. And if you are in the silence right now, if you are sitting in a house that used to be full and is now quiet, and you have been treating that quiet as something to fight and feel and escape, I want to ask you to try something tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. Turn off the television. Turn off the radio. Sit with the silence for 20 minutes and do not reach for anything. Just sit. It will be uncomfortable for a while. Let it be uncomfortable. What I found in that kitchen in February of 2020 was not comfortable at first either. It was just true. The empty house is not the end of the story. It is the room where the story you have never had time to hear finally has enough quiet to be told. I know this because I am 90 years old, and I have spent more of my life than I would like to admit running from that room. I am glad I stopped. I am glad the television broke. I am glad the children are busy in their own noisy houses. I would not have found what I found if they had not been. That is not a sentence I expected to be able to say, and I say it with complete honesty. Tell me in the comments, what did you find in your silence? One word, like I asked? Faith, peace, God, presence, something, yourself. I want to know, because I spent 89 years filling the quiet with everything I could find. And the one morning the television broke was the morning I found the only thing that mattered. Not in spite of the empty house, because of it.